There's many different areas and arenas in which I have conversations about religion. Most of them tend to deal with philosophical arguments or attempts to provide evidence. But there's an area that seems to exist in many different religions, or at least the most popular ones, which I think is, I've said before that the religious concept of the soul is the single most obviously dead topic that religions could ever raise, and yet it is at the foundation of all of them.
Dead as in debunked
As in,
by what we know about
yeah,
the mind?
what we know about the mind, about what we know about ourselves, about identity, that there's no reason to think that anything that makes me me could or should survive death merely by looking at traumatized brains. And
Right.
I remember a talk years ago from V.S. Ramachandran about split brain patients and how essentially you end up with, because of epilepsy or something, you split the corpus callosum, right?
Yeah.
And you end up with essentially two distinct personalities that communicate independently. And in this case study that he was doing, one side, which controlled the mouth and could speak, is that right or left?
Left.
See?
In most cases.
PhD neuroscience.
If you're right-handed, you're very likely you have a 95% chance that your language is on the left. If you're left-handed, it's more like 75%. But
Yeah, so the left side could talk and the right side could communicate using the left arm.
Yeah. And there's some people, the cases that are really startling with split brain research is where there's enough language on the right so that you get really independent records of belief and desire. And so, yeah, there was a classic case where this was actually a kid who was having grand mal seizures, was asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, and the articulate verbal left hemisphere said, I think, a draftsman, and I think these first experiments were in the early 60s, I think, and simultaneously his left hand was spelling out with letter cards, race car driver. And so this is the consequence of dividing, as you said, the corpus callosum that unites the two hemispheres of the brain.
The example, the case study that he had, one side was an atheist and the other side was a Christian.
Yeah.
And when I first heard it, Sam and I have very, very similar views on morality. As a matter of fact, if you ever care to hear what I think about morality, you can either watch my lecture on it or you can read his book, and you'll get pretty close to the same area. But when I heard this, there was something you had said about the peculiar math with the soul when it comes to twinning, about twins being reabsorbed. And it struck me when I was listening to Ramachandran talk about this patient that the same math applies with the soul. Did this person get two souls? Does it have two halves of soul? One of them's now damned.
Yeah, one's going to go to hell, yeah.
And this led to the thought of, okay, then you watch a movie like Memento, or any other good movie about damaging a brain. What if the day that I became an atheist, I actually got hit on the head and don't remember? And so now there's a Christian soul desperately trying to get this body to serve Jesus, and the body says no.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the consequences of, I write about this briefly in my book, Waking Up, but one of the consequences of the logic of these split brain experiments, which again there's very little diversity of opinion about what these experiments mean. But consciousness and subjectivity is divisible when you at the level of the brain. You divide these white matter tracks, or cut the white matter tracks that unite the cortex left and right, and you get these separate, independent islands of consciousness. But even in normal brains, you have the additional problem that there's no way the corpus callosum perfectly shares information across the hemispheres. So to some degree, we have to be divided most of the time or all of the time anyway. So there's this additional question of whether there are islands of conscious life, if there are areas where there's something that it's like to be you or to be your brain, that you, whoever you feel you are to be at this moment, don't know about. And so in the stark case of a split brain patient, you really do have this kind of, especially when language is not, when the right hemisphere is not articulate, you have this kind of silent subject just sort of waiting around, watching what the articulate left hemisphere says, and then occasionally revolting against it. I mean, there's bizarre cases where the left hemisphere is trying to dress itself, and the right hemisphere is trying to undress itself, or with the left arm he's hugging his wife, but with the right arm he's strangling her. You can have a starkly divided consciousness, and you do, and Ramachandran brings this up a lot, you do get a quasi-Freudian picture of the neurological detail, where it's quite possible that the unconscious, it's plausible to think that the unconscious is in many respects conscious, or differently conscious, and that is just downright weird.
I think it is weird, and you know, I said that as a joke about, you know, that day I got hit on the head, but we know that personalities, preferences, memories, all of the things that we package together to say, this is me, we know that all of these things can be changed through damage to the brain.
Yeah.
And that puts us in a situation where if we were to imagine that there was a soul that was good, that was saved, that was Christian or whatever, and yet it can't be the ghost in that machine because of damage. So now there's a physical body that is presenting itself as a completely different person. If we know that's possible, then how do we tell the difference between an individual who has this soul in congruence with the body? And if that's the case, if it's possible for a physical body to do all of the things that we attributed to the soul, essentially, if I'm fighting the soul on all these things or dismissing it, then my body, absent a soul, can do all of those things. Then what room left is there to presume a soul at all?
Well, the other problem with the soul, which has been pointed out for at least a couple hundred years, is that if it is immaterial, its interaction with the physics of things is genuinely mysterious. The idea that you could have something it clearly has to be integrated with the brain, given that it manages to accomplish speech and behavior. But that integration makes no sense. And as you say, this idea that you can selectively damage parts of the brain which really do lead to loss of function. I mean, you can lose your ability to recognize people, or to speak, or to understand basic concepts. This picture of a soul that will survive death is a picture of an intelligence that's losing none of those capacities. It's just kind of witnessing the loss of those capacities, and then will float off the brain at death. And we know that's not the way minds work. I mean, anyone who has lost any capacity knows that it's not a matter of you being, silently perfectly intact, wondering why the body's not working. No, you lose. You've lost this thing. If you can't remember, just think of what it's like not to remember somebody's name, right? If you're trying to think of that person's name, you know their name, but you can't. It's the tip of the tongue phenomenon. It's not like your soul's in there with the name saying, why won't he say the name? No, the subject, don't know the name, right? And that's
Going to be a video on YouTube next week, I'm sure.